introduce our presenter, David Bacon's. I knew him back when he was a union organizer. Came up through the United Farm Workers, the Boulders Union, worked with a number of other unions. And today he documents labor, the global economy, war and migration, and the struggle for human rights. His latest books are The Right to Stay Home, published in 2013, and which discusses alternatives to forced migration and the criminalization of migrants.
Okay, well, you asked me to come and talk tonight about how immigration policy and trade policy, and especially NAFTA, are linked to each other. And of course, Trump's in office talking about NAFTA, so this has become a very important question for all of us. So maybe we could start like they do on NPR with the numbers. Since 1984, about 8 million Mexicans have come to work in the United States as migrants. In 1990, there were about 4.5 million Mexican migrants living in the US, and in 2008, that number peaked at about 12.7 million people. Now, of those folks, about 5.7 million people were able to get some kind of visa to come here, which means that another 7 million people couldn't, because there aren't that many visas to be had, and people came nevertheless. So today, about 10% of the people of Mexico live in the US, what people in Mexico call El Gran Mexico. So one of the most important movements in Mexico today, no surprise, is for the right to stay home, el derecho de no migrar, which is talking about the right to an alternative. So to understand how we got here, I think it helps if we know a little bit of history here. So in 1986, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which we remember today as the Amnesty Law, also created a commission to investigate the causes of Mexican migration to the US. And it made a report to Congress in 1992 and said, surprise, surprise, that the biggest cause of migration was poverty. And so it recommended, as a cure, the negotiation of a free trade agreement. And that commission argued that opening the border to the flow of goods and capital, but not people, would, in the long run, produce jobs and rising income in Mexico, even if in the short run, it led to job loss and displacement. So the negotiations of the North American Free Trade Agreement began within months of that report. And it was sold to the public, to us, on both sides of the border as a migration preventing device. Corporate lobbyists claimed, for instance, in the US Congress that US exports to Mexico would account for 100,000 jobs here in the US in the first year of the agreement alone. Well, we're now what? How many years later? 25 years later, and we have a scorecard. And that scorecard says that the promises of profits, of increased investments and freer markets, those promises were kept. But the promises of jobs and benefits for working people were not. And as the commission itself said, NAFTA did lead to increasing unemployment and displacement and poverty. And workers in all of the 3 countries, Canada included, are still living with these devastating consequences, while the predicted long-range benefits never materialized. So what has produced migration from the rural parts of Mexico is the same thing that closed factories in the US. Green Giant, for instance, we might remember that they closed their broccoli freezer in Watsonville, and 1,000 immigrant Mexican workers lost their jobs when it moved to Irapuato, where the company could pay lower wages to another group of Mexican workers. Part of the purpose for negotiating NAFTA was to allow US agribusiness corporations to sell their products in Mexico and to use the subsidies that they receive from us in the form of the Farm Bill, the taxes that we pay, to undercut Mexican prices so that Mexican farmers couldn't sell what they produced. NAFTA let huge US companies, should we name some names? How about Archer Daniels Midland? You listen to NPR, they always talk about, brought to you by Archer Daniels Midland. Or Continental Grain Company. They allowed these companies to sell corn in Mexico for a price that was lower than what it cost farmers in Mexico to grow it. And again, those big US companies got huge subsidies from Congress, and so they sold corn in Mexico at 19% below their cost of production here. And that difference, that 19%, was made up by us. Mexican imports went from 2 million to 10.3 million tons of corn from 1992 to 2008. So remember, that's the same period which we saw the increase in the number of Mexicans living here. In the same period, the price of pork went down 56%. Mexico imported 30,000 tons of pork in 1995, and by 2010, it was 811,000 tons. In pork production, Mexico lost over 120,000 jobs. We're talking about slaughterhouses and people who work in meat processing. And one US company, although we could now say one Chinese US company, Smithfield Foods, now controls over 25% of the market for pork in Mexico. That's saying that 1 out of every 4 meals eaten by a family in Mexico that has pork is coming from Smithfield Foods. So hundreds of thousands of Mexican farmers couldn't make a living, and some of them are living in communities that have been growing corn for thousands of years. In fact, in a cave near Oaxaca City, they have found the first ears of corn, the first domesticated ears of corn. This is where corn cultivation started. The irony of it is that those are the same communities where corn farmers are being expelled by this whole process because people had to leave in order to survive from the very same communities that gave us corn to begin with. At the same time, Mexico could no longer pass laws to encourage their own producers. Mexico, before NAFTA, had subsidized programs to buy corn and agricultural products from farmers, then to process it and sell it at low subsidized prices in government-operated stores. Remember the Conasupo stores? That's what we're talking about here, to poor people. This was declared a restraint on the ability of corporations like Walmart to enter the Mexican market, and those programs were abolished. Mexico had other agricultural programs for tobacco and coffee, for instance, to keep prices from falling too low. Those were also abolished. And when coffee and tobacco prices then fell, the government couldn't buy those products in order to help farmers by raising them. And so as a consequence, thousands of failed tobacco and coffee farmers from states like Veracruz then began coming to the United States, where a lot of them became wage workers in tobacco fields here, working for the big tobacco companies. In essence, Mexico lost the ability to control a lot of its economy, especially in the interests of working people and the poor. And as a result, by the government's own estimates, 40% of Mexicans live in poverty and 20% live in extreme poverty. And despite the promises made when NAFTA took effect, that statistic has been virtually unchanged for 25 years. The lack of labor rights, combined with economic reforms to benefit large corporations, is another source of migration. Several years ago, the Mexican government sent in the army to all the power plants in Mexico City and central Mexico and fired all 44,000 workers working for the Compañía de Luz y Fuerza in order to destroy the union there. And not long after, the government changed the constitution so that it can now sell the electrical grid to foreign private investors. But what's going to happen to those 44,000 people? Where are they going to go? In 23 years since NAFTA was signed, or actually now 25, Mexican labor protections, which on paper were greater than those in the US, Mexico still has better labor laws than we do, have been rolled back. The administration of the last Mexican president, Felipe Calderon, forced through a set of labor reforms to legitimize contingent work and to erode workers' rights. Sound pretty familiar. It's like what we have here. Unions that have tried to stand in the way of those changes have been attacked by an alliance between the government and employers. The head of the miners' union in Mexico, for instance, Napoleon Gomez Urrutia, was forced to flee to Canada, where he's been living in Vancouver ever since, when the government threatened to arrest him, and his crime was that he had accused the government of industrial homicide after an explosion in a mine that belonged to one of Mexico's wealthiest families of Hermano Larrea. Meanwhile, a new mining law in Mexico has led to the sale of mining concessions, primarily to huge Canadian companies, covering over a third of Mexico's entire territory. Over 8 years ago, to stop this multinational corporation from eliminating their jobs and busting their union, Now, when they lost their jobs as a result of what's happened in that strike, and the border's only 50 miles north, what do you think those miners had to do in order to survive? So those miners, or those electrical workers that got fired, what are they fighting for? They're fighting for el derecho de no migrar, for the right to be able to stay in Mexico, for the right to stay home. Because when you lose a struggle like that in Mexico, what it means is that you have to often leave in order to survive. At the same time, NAFTA allowed companies to sue over lost profit opportunities. I love this one. One case was filed against Mexico by a company called Metalclad that wanted to burn toxic waste. Those energy companies want to develop fracking wells all over northern Mexico, and they can now sue Mexico if the government doesn't let them drill. Not that government wants to prevent them anyway, because again, they've given concessions to over a third of Mexican territory, but the law says also that corporations that hold these concessions can overrule any local community that tries to stop them. What does that mean? That means if you live in a town where one of these companies move in to develop a mine or a fracking well or something like that and your environment becomes unbearable, you cannot, under the law, stop it. So what are your options then if you want to survive? The Mexican government is basically holding down incomes in order to encourage corporate investment in industries that are producing for export. This is the model of the maquiladoras. And under NAFTA, what's happened is that what was a limited experiment in that 100-mile swath just south of the U.S. border has now become the norm in all of Mexico. And what it really means is that if you work in that Lexmark plant that you were talking about, Carl, making stuff for export, those ink cartridges for export to the U.S., you have to labor on the line, and these are almost all women, have to labor on the line for half a day to buy a gallon of milk for your kids. So maquiladora workers, you go to Juarez, or you go to Matamoros or Tijuana, and what you see is that people are living in homes that are made from shipping pallets and other materials that are cast off by the factories in barrios that have no sewers, no running water, and where you're robbing electricity from the electrical lines. And because our two economies are linked together, Mexico, as they say, gets pneumonia when the U.S. catches a cold. When our recession started here in 2008, and we stopped buying the products that were being made in those maquiladoras, what happened to the workers in those factories? Hundreds of thousands of people lost their jobs. Where are they going to go? Markets in Mexico were open to these huge corporations. Mexico used to have a domestic content law that required foreign auto plants to purchase from domestic suppliers. With NAFTA, that was scrapped. And so consequently, many domestic producers in Mexico of auto parts no longer had guaranteed customers, and they closed. Market reforms. So NAFTA is part of some of these economic changes that are bigger than just the agreement itself. And it's important to see that because, for instance, one of the reforms that was undertaken in Mexico resulted in the privatization of other industries as well, too. One family became owner of its most important railroads, the Larrea family, as well as the mine in Cananea and other mines. Another family became the owner of the steel mill in Lázaro Cárdenas. Carlos Slim, who at one point was the world's richest human, bought the telephone company at a bargain price sold by the Mexican government, becoming the second largest shareholder in the New York Times. So you wonder why the New York Times loves NAFTA and free trade, and Tom Friedman writes all those columns. There you have it. In the last 25 years of that agreement, Mexico created 15 billionaires. The net wealth of the 10 richest people in Mexico represents roughly 10% of the country's gross domestic product. Now, teachers have been on strike in Mexico over and over and over and over again for several years, trying to defeat a kind of corporate education reform that was invented where? Here. That's right. This is another export that we made to Mexico. And those teachers are upset not only about what is going to happen to their own jobs and their own security, but because also there's so little alternative to migration for the young people that are in their classes. So in Mexico and in developing countries all over the world, because it's not just Mexico, people want an alternative, of course. The right to a decent life in the communities where people live, the right to stay home. It's not that there's something wrong with migration or leaving home, but it should be voluntary. Something you can decide to do or decide not to do. Something that's not forced on you. Now here in the US, our economic system also depends on migration and migrants. If everybody went home tomorrow, would we have fruits and vegetables in the supermarket?
No.
Who would cut up the cows? Who cleans the offices in the office buildings downtown? Who makes the beds in the hotels? But who pays for the needs of the workers' families in the towns that they're coming from? In those little towns in Mexico or in Central America, who pays for the schools? Who pays for paving the streets? You know, those growers in Watsonville, those strawberry growers, or the, what's the name guy? Shorenstein, the guy that owns the buildings downtown here. You think he pays for any of that stuff in Mexico? Nothing. Workers pay for everything. And since they can't really pay for everything they need, Santiago Huixlahuaca, which is the Oaxacan town that sends hundreds of workers into the strawberry fields in Watsonville, has no sewage treatment plant on the river there. That's where people are getting their drinking water. If someone in the family of a worker in the US gets sick, maybe that worker can send enough money home to pay for a doctor. But for Huixlahuaca's residents who have no one in the US to pay for it, there is no doctor because the healthcare system in Mexico is falling apart. So to employers, this system is a labor supply system, really. And for them it works very well because they don't have to pay for what the system really costs, either in Mexico or in the US. So when we say broken system, we should be very careful about what we mean by that. Broken for us, not broken for them. Trade policy and immigration policy are inextricably bound up with each other. They're part of the same system. And you know, NAFTA didn't just displace Mexicans, it displaced people in the United States too. Until 2005, our Department of Labor kept track of workers who could show that their employers had moved their jobs to Mexico because you got extended unemployment insurance. That was part of the deal. In 2005, George Bush ordered the department to stop counting because it was embarrassing the politicians who had voted for the agreement. And by 2010, trade deficits with Mexico, according to the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, had eliminated 682,900 jobs here in the US, most, 60% of them, in manufacturing. So since NAFTA took effect, NAFTA-related trade deficits displaced production that supported even more, 1,015,291 jobs, according to EPI. Canada lost jobs too, 400,000 jobs in NAFTA's first 4 years alone. And in the US, our unionization rates fell as a consequence of this, because as unionized jobs were offshored, the unionized portion of those jobs went from 45% to 32%. In other words, it was attacking those sectors of our economy where unions were the strongest. In the US, there was another consequence of the connection between NAFTA and immigration policy, and that was immigration enforcement. At the border, in raids in our communities, in the workplace, all these raids accelerated. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, said last year that they had audited the records of 2,000 companies, 1 year alone. So as a consequence, over the period of time since the Immigration Reform and Control Act has been in effect, IRCA, thousands and thousands and thousands of workers have lost their jobs, fired because they didn't have a good Social Security number or immigration documents. And some people are not just fired, they get picked up and deported. So we know, right? 400,000 people a year got deported under President Obama. And now Trump says that wasn't enough, you know? What's happening, though, as a result of all of this is that enforcement is pushing workers into the informal section of the economy. What are we talking about? We're talking about day laborers. We're talking about people who do domestic work, where people don't ask for immigration documents. After all, this is what people like Trump say. You know, they're going to create jobs for Americans, quote unquote, right? This doesn't create jobs at all. Instead, what really happens is that workers lose their homes when they can't pay their mortgage or they can't pay their rent. And it doesn't punish employers. You know, this system is called employer sanctions. You know, where supposedly you're going to punish employers if they hire people who don't have papers. The reality is that when they do this kind of enforcement, ICE rewards employers for cooperating and firing their own workers by immunizing them from prosecution. So the policy only hurts workers. And even more important, it has a big impact on the ability of people to create social change. Because these immigration raids very often get implemented in places where workers are organizing unions, or where they're protesting or demanding, 5 for 15. You know, we had a whole series of them in Burger King, for instance, when 5 for 15 came in the East Bay. In the last few decades, Detroit lost half its population as the auto industry left, and today every engine in a Ford comes from Mexico. But the working families who lost those outsourced jobs, they didn't disappear either. What happened to them? Hundreds of thousands of people began an internal migration in the US that's larger than the Dust Bowl migration that we read so much about in the 1930s, you know, the Grapes of Wrath. During this same period, our wages here in the United States have remained virtually flat. In 2006, CPI found a nationwide loss of $7.6 billion in wages that we would have earned had trade been balanced. NAFTA strengthened the ability of employers here to force workers to accept those lower wages and benefits. There's a professor at Cornell, Kate Bronfenbrenner, and she did a study of this, and she found that after NAFTA passed, 1 out of every 10 employers facing a union drive simply told their workers that they would move to Mexico. So in the 25 years of this agreement, the number of people in the US who were born somewhere else, because after all, we're not just talking about the US and Mexico, went from 23 million people to 42 million people. And this is the same period, not only in which NAFTA went into effect, but in which these same kinds of market-based economic reforms were implemented in Honduras, in Guatemala, in countries all over the world, the Philippines. This system produces displaced people, and then it criminalizes them when they migrate. It makes people vulnerable, and low wages mean higher profits. Over 365,000 people are kept in detention in the US at some time or another every year. You know, we passed a law, it was part of the budget that Obama signed, that said that we now have a 34,000 person bed quota, meaning that by law there have to be at least 34,000 people in detention at any given moment. The border is like an armed camp. You know, we already have 25,000 Border Patrol agents. Obama's talking about hiring another 5,000 of them. The federal government's already spending more money on immigration enforcement than all the other law enforcement programs of the federal government combined. You think Congress wants to stop migration? Why does it pass bills that are designed to produce displacement at the same time as it says that it wants to stop it? You know, more migration is really inevitable, at least so long as this kind of market-based arrangement remains in place. You know, another 5,000 Border Patrol agents on the border, another 10,000 ICE agents is producing jobs for some people, and those people are very vocal about it. More detention centers are producing profit for Geo Corporation or Corrections Corporation of America or whatever the hell they're calling themselves these days. But neither one of these things, not more Border Patrol agents nor detention centers, are keeping people from crossing the border. What about the wall? Is the wall going to stop people?
No way.
You know, Boeing got a contract under Bush to build sections of the wall. You know, those 700 miles of the wall that we already have, that Carl was talking about. And to put in electronic sensors and lights and so on. You know, and for that, Boeing pocketed $4 billion and then turned around and told the federal government that the effort was a failure. And the program and the contract was canceled. And now they're all lining up again, right? You know, the wall doesn't stop people because the force that is pushing people to come is so great that people are going to find a way. But that wall is a potent symbol. Remember, Trump ran for office, and what did those crowds say when he was speaking? Build the wall, build the wall. And more companies are now going to get contracts for building more sections of it. So our immigration policy, it doesn't really stop people from coming, and it's not intended to. What it does is it determines what the status is of people once they're here, to benefit large financial interests, especially employers. Immigration policy is intended to supply labor to employers, and that labor should have a low cost imposed by employers, and the workers involved should be vulnerable. And as Trump increases enforcement, those employers are going to demand more workers. Think about it. You know, those growers out in Watsonville, Trump picks up the workers there. What are those growers going to do about people to pick those strawberries? You know, enforcement, it's not all by itself. It doesn't exist just for its own sake. It plays a role in a bigger system that serves capitalist economic interests by supplying the labor force that employers in this country need. And so high levels of enforcement also ensure the profits of companies that manage detention and enforcement, who lobby for deportations just as hard as Boeing lobbies for that wall or for the military budget. You know, immigrant labor is more vital to many industries in the U.S. than it's ever been before. You know, immigrants have always made up the majority of the country's farm workers in the West and Southwest. And today, according to the Department of Labor, about 57% of all farm workers in the United States are undocumented. But the list of other industries, you know, we could name them off right here, right now, right? You know, meatpacking, construction, healthcare, you know, it goes on and on. During this last campaign, Trump pledged, he issued a 100-day action plan to make America great again. And one part of that plan says, quote, to begin removing the more than 2 million criminal illegal immigrants from the country on his first day in office. And then in speeches, he promised to eventually force all undocumented people, estimated about 11 million people, to leave. So, you know, we live in a society that has one of the highest incarceration rates in the world. And so crimes in the United States are often defined very broadly. Under Bush, for instance, federal prosecutors charged workers with felonies for supplying a bad Social Security number to an employer. That was called document fraud. Some of Trump's advisors, like Bannon especially, have said that crossing the border itself is a crime, and therefore all undocumented people are criminals. And it's not just Bannon. Remember, the Sensenbrenner bill, 4425, what did it say? It said that being in the United States without papers would be a felony. That's what caused all those marches in 2006. So this isn't just Trump and Bannon. This is something that's been going on for a while here. Of course, is a source of an enormous profit to employers. You know, the Pew Hispanic Center estimates that out of the 11 million people in the U.S. without documents, about 8 million people are employed. That's about 5% of the U.S. workforce. Most people are earning close to the minimum wage, and some people are earning a lot less, and they're also clustered in low-wage industries. You know, there was a survey that was done by this guy, Rick Mines, called the Indigenous Farm Workers Survey, in which he surveyed people speaking indigenous languages from Mexico working as farm workers in California, about the estimated 165,000 people. And he found that a third of those people said that they were working for less than minimum wage. In other words, tens of thousands of people growers are knowingly paying illegal wages to. Now, our federal minimum wage is stuck at $7.25 an hour, and it's not likely to rise anytime soon. And here in California, what do we have? We have $10 an hour. That gives workers an annual income of $20,000. Now, Social Security says that the average wage for a worker in the United States is just over $48,000 a year. I read that, I went, boy, you know, I'm way below that. But nevertheless, this is what they say. The reason why that's important is you think about it for a second. If employers were paying the undocumented workforce in this country the average U.S. wage, it would cost them over $200 billion a year. You think they're not going to fight for that money? That wage differential, it subsidizes whole industries, like agriculture and food processing. And if that workforce gets withdrawn, the way Trump threatens, through deportations or mass firings, employers wouldn't be able to replace it without raising wages drastically. So, as president, Trump is going to have to ensure that the labor needs of employers are met at a price they want to pay. For all of the rhetoric, the corporate appointees in his administration, what do they tell us? They tell us that any of that rhetoric about going against big business is just that, bullshit. It's rhetoric. But the reality is that Hillary Clinton would have faced exactly the same problem. And in fact, the immigration proposals in Congress from both Republicans and Democrats over the last decade, they shared that same understanding, which is that the purpose of U.S. immigration policy is to satisfy corporate labor demands. During the debates over those immigration bills in Congress, the Council on Foreign Relations, which is like the ruling class of the United States, this is their voice, they proposed two goals for our immigration policy. They had a task force called the Independent Task Force on U.S. Immigration Policy, and the guy who authored their report, a guy named Edward Alden, he said, we should reform the legal immigration system so that it operates more efficiently, responds more accurately to labor market needs, and enhances U.S. competitiveness. I'm a union person, so when employers start talking about competitiveness, I know what that means, right? It means low wages. And then he went on to add, we should restore the integrity of immigration laws through an enforcement regime that strongly discourages employers and employees from operating outside that legal system. So what he's doing here is that he is coupling together this enforcement regime with deportations and firings to supplying labor to employers. Those two things are connected. This is the people who have power in this country speaking. It's just not Red David bullshitting you. So this whole idea that they have, it assumes that the flow of people here, coming here, the flow of migration is going to continue, and then they're seeking to try and manage it in the interest of the system here. And that's a pretty safe assumption because the basic clauses of that flow of people haven't changed. The same economic rules still apply to Mexico. The same agricultural subsidies and trade agreements. That's the same rapacious development of the Mexican countryside by mining companies and whatnot, the impoverishment of Mexican workers, and the violence that's a consequence of that. All of that plays a part in forcing people to leave, and none of that is stopping anytime soon. NAFTA in order to get votes, and let's remember, Barack Obama did that too. He can't, given his ties to business, he doesn't even have any will to change the basic relationship between the United States and Mexico and the United States and Central America, which is an imperial relationship, or the other developing countries that are sources of migration. And the structures for managing the flow of migrants are already in place, and they don't require Congress to pass any kind of bill about it. In Washington State, for instance, the Washington Farm Labor Association, which is a labor contractor that brings in workers on H-2 visas from other countries, they brought in 2,000 workers under the H-2A program in 2006. In 2013, it went to 4,000. 2015, it went to 11,000. Last year, it went to 13,500. And that same growth is taking place here in California and Arizona and Oregon and all over the place. And this H-2A program, what it does is it allows growers to recruit workers outside the country for periods of less than a year, after which they have to return to their country of origin. So the people who come here, if they lose their jobs for whatever reason, let's say they offend their employer by trying to organize their union or simply protesting about having to do overtime at straight time pay, they get fired, they have to leave the country. It's not just that they lose their job. So joining a union or protesting those conditions, that can be pretty risky. This program is only one of several. So we're just talking about the one for agriculture, but there are a bunch of them. There was a report called Visas Incorporated that was put out by Global Workers Justice, and they found that 900,000 people are brought to the United States every year under these kinds of programs in one form or another. And what this really does is it reminds us all of the Bracero program, right? 1942 to 1964. And again, this is connected with enforcement. 1954, the United States brought in 450,000 people from Mexico under the Bracero program. And they deported a million people. That was the largest number of people deported in a single year from the United States in our history. So they've always gone together. They've always gone together. And arresting people at the border and firing people from their jobs for not having papers or sending people to detention centers for deportation, what they do is they all push this flow of migrants into labor schemes that are managed to benefit corporations. And the more the Trump administration pushes for deportations and internal enforcement, the more it is going to rely on expanding these programs in order to make sure that employers in this country get what they want. And the growers, they say that they need these workers because there aren't enough workers here. But the reality is that if you go to the farm worker towns of California, what you find is that the unemployment rate is twice what it is in urban areas. In Los Angeles, when the unemployment rate was 5%, in the Imperial Valley, it was 16%, right next to the Mexican border, 3 times as high. And that's true for Delano, it's true for Fresno, it's true for Watsonville, Salinas. And as a result of this kind of enforced job competition, farm workers earn 40 cents for every dollar that's paid to other workers. Again, all this goes together, right? Those migrant workers are never going to have power if they have to leave the country when they lose their jobs. They need a system that produces security instead of insecurity. So instead of a temporary visa that's tied to work, guest worker visas, people need green cards. They need residence visas that at least give people some degree of rights and don't force them to leave if they're not working. We have to think about what kind of system would be better for migrants in the communities that people are coming from and working people generally. The United Nations, for instance, it has an international convention on the rights of migrant workers and their families, and that guarantees basic rights and equality. That's where we should begin, not with international guest worker programs. I have a friend, Rufino Dominguez, who was the former binational coordinator for the Frente Indígena de Organizaciones Binacionales. He also worked for a while for the Oaxacan government. And he once told me, what would improve our situation is legal status for the people already in the U.S. and more visas based on family reunification. Decent wages and investing money in creating jobs in our countries of origin would decrease the pressure forcing us to leave home. Making it illegal to work won't stop migration because it doesn't deal with why people come. So the solidarity and the migration of people are also linked. Oaxacan migrant communities are growing here in the United States, and the founders of the Frente Indígena saw that it was possible to organize displaced people who now live in many places in both Mexico and the U.S. When Oaxacan workers went on strike at Sakuma Farms in Washington State, the director of the Frente Indígena in Oaxaca, Bernardo Ramirez, he went up to Washington State to help those workers organize. And then when Sakuma tried to recruit guest workers, the Frente Indígena met with the Mexican consulate and the Department of Labor to try and stop them. Now those workers in Washington State, they have a union now, and pretty soon they're going to have a union contract with Sakuma Farms because of what those migrants from Oaxaca are able to do, both in the U.S. and in Mexico. The Frente Indígena has campaigned for the rights of migrants in the U.S., for amnesty and for legalization for undocumented people, and against proposals for guest workers. Bernardo Ramirez, when he was in Washington State, he said, "I'm here as the coordinator of the Frente Indígena because this strike is part of our people's struggle as migrants. What people are demanding here is justice for them as workers. The growers should give people what the law demands in fair conditions. This is their right." And Gaspar Rivera Salgado, who was the former coordinator of the Frente Indígena, he says, "We need our rights as workers and migrants, and also development that makes migration voluntary, the right to stay home." Both rights are part of the same solution. But the right to migrate is more than the right, has to be more than the right to be poor, the right to go hungry and homeless, to decide freely whether to stay home or leave. Each alternative has to provide a future that is dignified for people. So we have to assess what Trump means and what he intends when he says he wants to renegotiate NAFTA. Is he planning to stop U.S. auto companies from building cars in Mexico and exporting them to the U.S.? Those car companies employ more auto workers in Mexico now than they do on this side of the border. Every flat panel television that we buy in a store here, well, most of them are made in Mexico, and all of them are made outside the U.S. But you know, renegotiating NAFTA isn't a bad idea if what it means is prohibiting the kinds of measures that cause displacement. But is this what Trump has in mind? How much change in NAFTA do we need? And how can we fight for it, especially in the kind of political climate that we have now? You know, Mike Michaud, who was the first gay member of the legislature in the state of Maine, he was a former officer of the Paper Workers Union, and then went to Congress and served quite a while in Congress. And while he was in Congress, he introduced a bill that was called the Trade Act. And he proposed hearings to tell the truth about what NAFTA's impact has been. We need a truth commission to talk about not just what its impact has been on people in Mexico, but also on people here, so that we don't fall into the trap of, well, they got our jobs, and that we can see Mexican workers and farmers lost even more than we did on this side of the border. We were both displaced. We both went on the road. You know, Bernie Sanders proposed prohibiting companies that close factories and relocate them from getting federal contracts. That's a pretty good step too. But you know, people like Bert Corona, who's the father of our modern immigrant rights movement, he had an alternative to this. And what Bert said was that immigrants are not victims. And he talked about the power of organized resistance by immigrants themselves, but also by the community around them. And he was a labor guy, a union organizer, and he talked especially about the power of immigrants as workers and about the importance of unions. And we know this is true here. In California especially, San Francisco especially, because immigrant workers have gone on strike in factories and office buildings and laundries and hospitals and hotels and fields. And the battles that have been fought by immigrants over the last 20 years are making life for workers here better and are making our unions stronger today than they were before. These rights are linked. The right to stay home and the right to equality and dignity when you leave home. And for people's families in Mexico and Guatemala and El Salvador, the Philippines, people deserve a decent life wherever they live, whether they live at home or whether they choose to migrate. And young people in those communities have a right to not migrate, el derecho de no migrar. And for that, we have to change agreements like NAFTA. That's it.